Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So today's guest on the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast is Colin Campbell. I first heard about Colin through a former guest who was deeply moved by an article he had written. Her words piqued my curiosity, and when I finally read Colin's piece, I immediately understood why. It was powerful, honest, and deeply human. We later crossed paths through mutual colleagues, and it became clear that we shared not just a passion for helping others navigate grief, but also the personal experience of child loss. That shared bond drew me to invite him onto the podcast. So Colin brings a heartfelt and courageous voice to conversation around grief, and I'm honored to have him here today to share his story, insights, and the wisdom he's gained on his journey through unimaginable loss. So about this week's guest. Colin Campbell is a writer and director for theatre and film. He was nominated for an Academy Award for Seraglio, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a short film he wrote and directed with his lovely and talented wife, Gail Lerner. He has taught theatre and/or filmmaking at Chapman University, Loyola Marymount University, Cal Poly Pomona University, and to incarcerated youth. His book, Finding the Words, Working Through Profound Loss with Hope and Purpose, was published by Penguin Random House in 2023. He wrote and performs Grief, a one-man shit show, which premiered at the Hollywood Fringe Festival and ran for a month at New York's Theatre Row. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, and modernloss.com. Most recently, he was a keynote speaker at the Compassionate Friends National Conference. So welcome, Colin.
Hi, thank you, Natalie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to be here with us and the audience. So, as we always do, I start by asking you, how has loss and trauma and grief been or become part of your life?
So my loss and trauma story began June 12th, 2019, so almost 6 years ago. I was driving my family up to Joshua Tree. We live in Los Angeles, and Joshua Tree is a sweet desert town, high desert town, about 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles. And we were almost there, almost to Joshua Tree, when a drunken high driver going 90 miles an hour T-boned our car. And so that driver survived, and my wife and I survived in the front seat, but Ruby and Hart, my two children, were killed in the back seat.
Wow.
And Ruby was 17 and Hart was 14. And actually their birthdays were just yesterday and the day before.
What an honor to remember them in their story and in your storytelling as well on their birthdays.
Thank you. It was very impactful. I think I chose this day to be interviewed by you because of that. So I'll tell a little bit later about how we honored their birthdays yesterday.
I'd love to know.
And I come from a very waspy background, an atheist. My parents are atheists. We were raised as atheists. I'm an atheist. And as a result, I had no real cultural background, no real cultural practices around grief and grieving, sort of the opposite. I often describe my family as grief averse, like we don't talk about, quote unquote, the bad stuff. And so when Ruby and Hart were killed, I really was lost, totally lost about how to even begin to grieve. And luckily, my wife's Jewish. and we raised Ruby and Hart as Jews. So they were bar and bat mitzvahed, and we're all members of the temple, active members, and I just decided I would lean into whatever the rabbi told me to do. That was sort of what my mantra was, like whatever she says, Rabbi Sharon Brous, whatever she says, I'm just going to do. And I found that I learned so much about grief and grieving from these practices. So again, not from a religious background. I wasn't thinking about God. I was thinking about how to grieve. And so many of the Jewish rituals revolve around community. So, even sitting Shiva, people come to your house for seven nights. Well, really 6 because you don't do it during Shabbat, but 6 nights after the funeral, people come to your house and sit with you in grief. And that was a remarkable thing for me. My instinct was stay away, right? My children were just killed. What do you mean 150 people are going to come to my house and just be with me? Like 150. Yeah, we had a lot of people every night come to our house. It was packed.
Like per night, 150
per
people?
night. Yeah,
Wow.
per night.
Okay.
And so my first instinct was, no, don't do that. But then I thought, well, I'm just going to listen to the rabbi. We're going to do it. And this kind of incredible thing happened where the rabbi came and said some prayers and then turned to Gail and I and said, would you like to say anything to all these people? And I found that I did. I wanted to talk about grief and grieving and Ruby and Hart. I wanted to tell them stories. And they wanted to share stories. So we opened it up and everybody was tell Ruby and Hart stories. And my children were quite extraordinary. I know everybody thinks their kids are the best, but mine actually were the coolest. No offense to anybody else listening. But they were really remarkable children, and everyone had wonderful stories about them. And so we laughed and cried together, and night after night. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. This is what grieving is. I get it now. But then when Shiva ended, when the structure of Shiva ended, people suddenly became scared to talk to us. They became scared to even say Ruby and Hart's names, which was so interesting, right? The same people who were just, happily telling, not happily, we were crying, but telling stories about Ruby and Hart, suddenly without that structure, they didn't know what to say.
I'm actually interested a little bit. There's a question for me, like from what you were saying, like you felt like, okay, no, I don't want to meet 150 people, or I don't know how many you expected. And then to the point where you actually felt, oh my God, this is meaningful to me. This is helping me. What happened in this process from where you were at the beginning to where you then got something out of the process of community of Shiva?
Yeah. Well, it was pretty immediate. I remember just as soon as we started talking about, well, first of all, when she turned to us and said, do you have anything to say? It was like, yes. Because I think because we've been sitting in this unimaginable grief, for us unimaginable, and literally unimaginable. So our imagination couldn't wrap ourselves around it, right? I couldn't understand it. I couldn't believe it to be real.
Yeah.
And so I'm in this state of disbelief and confusion and overwhelming sense of not being able to really understand or process what's just happened to me. And then when I start to talk, I felt like, oh, this is so helpful to me. I want to get it out. I want to tell these people something about this horror. If that makes sense. And so I really desperately wanted to talk about what was happening to me. And then quickly turned to, I want to talk about Ruby and Hart. Yeah. So I think it was pretty immediate. There's one point where our kids were very funny. And so Gail, my wife Gail, was telling a story about Hart, and it involved a prop. So he had this crazy character called Sarah. He was an amazing actor. He was only 14, but he was an amazing presence and funny. And he would do these characters, and they all had names, and all his friends knew them. And so they'd call them out by name. They'd say, oh, do Sarah, and do Richard, do whatever. And he would just suddenly launch into this character. And often they were foul-mouthed. But Sarah was a beauty influencer. And she was always talking about how amazingly, incredibly beautiful she was. And then so one day for a special episode of Sarah, he came downstairs and he's just talking to Gail and I. It's just our kid, like nobody else is there, but he's playing this character and he says, I want to tell you something. I want to show you all. I know you're sometimes my beauty is overwhelming and it's intimidating. I want to show you all my true self. And then he went away and he put on this dog mask over his head, this pug mask over his whole head. And he came back out and said, "This is what I look like without my makeup on." And it was just like hilarious. And, Kel and I were just minding our own business in the living room, and suddenly we get like entertained by this kid.
Yeah.
And so she ran and got the pug mask and put it on. She said, "I can't believe I'm doing prop comedy at my children's Shiva." But that was like, we needed to share that stuff,
Yeah. So then I interrupted you before where you were actually talking about the same people who came and you spoke about that and suddenly couldn't speak again or didn't have that structure. What happened then?
Yeah. So at first it was like, I can't, this is not going to work for me. Like I need to talk about Ruby and Heart, about grief. And I need to have these conversations because I was taught that by Shiva. And so I said, I need to change what's happening here. I need to teach them that it's okay to talk to me about Ruby and Heart. And so I developed what I call my grief spiel. And so Gail and I would both do this. We'd pull people aside one at a time and we'd tell them, this is the deal. Like, I need you to talk about Ruby and Heart. I need you to say their names. Also, I want you to talk about your kids. People were scared to even mention their children. And it makes a lot of sense. Like, yeah, it is upsetting to me to hear about your living children when my kids are killed, but it also felt, when nobody was talking about their own lives, it felt like we were cut off.
Yeah.
We were outside the community now. We were no longer part of this community that shared things. And so it was further alienating. So I had to tell people, talk about your kids. It's okay. And my grief spiel kept evolving. Every day it would change a little bit because I would discover a new thing that either upset me or that I needed, or and I would just modify it,
So you basically told people, this is what I need. This is how you can best support me through that process.
Yeah. And what was so nice is that it got immediate positive feedback because all my friends were like, "Oh, thank God. Thank you for telling me this. I had no idea. I'm so grateful you told me this." And that was eye-opening. That I could say what I want, because it's a weird thing to do, right? It's like breaking a social contract. You don't tell your friends how to talk to you. That's weird.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I think I shared with you in our pre-conversation that at the time when I had my loss, it was similar that I shared through Facebook. It was Facebook notes at the time. I shared with people, hey, this is what I actually need and this is what I don't need. And I think underlying is a sort of an expectation, or I hear that a lot from clients, that people should just know. And the fact is they don't. And, the phrase, I can't imagine what you're going through, for some people is really hurtful, because basically what they're saying, I'd rather not imagine what you're going through. They could if they wanted to. But the truth is within the sentence is that really people lack the experience, so they don't know what we're going through and they don't know what we need. And also the needs of grieving parents in specifics, but also grieving people in general, is individual. Some people want to speak about that and want to hear about, and other people think, well, why do you complain about your kids? I don't have them anymore.
Right.
But it is a conversation that needs to happen.
Right. Yeah. That's why I sort of love this idea of a grief spiel, because it's the individual. It's the individual griever telling their community what they need, and it changes too. My grief needs changed radically, over the first few weeks and months.
Yeah.
And that's something also I think that people don't understand on the outside, that how we feel and what we need changes. So, I think very often, especially in the early days, grieving people do push people away. Like, I don't want to spend time with you right now. And people misinterpret that and think, oh, let's leave them alone forever. Right? They don't, let's not talk to them forever. they need to process. They'll come to us when they're ready. And then a lot of grieving people, myself included, were like, wait, where'd everybody go? I need the support.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like that we need to be left forever, but it's like, it's again, some people need some time, but in general, I would say grievers are left alone to digest for longer than they in fact need, or they need some at least contact, like reaching out, and maybe sometimes without getting an answer, but at least some connection. Yeah, so, absolutely. In terms of the needs changing, that's an interesting one, because now in my case, it's 13 and a half years since my daughter died. And I remember in the beginning, there was a desire to tell everyone that I had twins, because those who didn't know that I was pregnant with twins would see one and they would say, oh, I'm so happy. And so that has changed to the point now where when people ask me, how many children do you have? I respond according to the situation. Sometimes, especially when my daughter is there, I might say two, but we also have changing conversations, because for her as well, it has changed that she wants her sister to be named or not, because she has had situations where people would say, well, where is she? And she's now coming to teenage years where situations are different. How is that for you? How would you say has it developed your needs? If you want to look back over the 6 years, that might be an interesting way to give sort of people on the outside a bit of a timeline.
Yeah. It's changed a lot. And so like in the early days, I needed to tell everybody that I was a grieving parent. It was so central. I couldn't really have a conversation with someone for very long without telling them that.
Yeah.
And in fact, so I'm a professor. I teach film and theater. And so in the first few years, I would tell my students on the first day, also, I'm a bereaved father. My kids were killed by a drunk driver. I'm very comfortable talking about grief and grieving. And those poor students, they went with it. They were all good, but, about it. But I couldn't teach. I couldn't honestly be present without telling people this, because it was so central to what was happening to me. It felt like a lie if I didn't say that. And now I don't need to tell my students. I do if it comes up organically, for sure. I just told a student just on Wednesday last week, because he asked, do you have any kids? And so I just told him, yes. The full answer is I have 4 kids. I have 2 kids who were killed by a drunk driver, and I have 2 kids that I'm in the process of foster adopting. And so I like to, whenever I get asked the question, I think I almost always say that full answer. I almost never just, skip the grief part. But that's just me and I like to tell people if they ask, but I don't have that need to. That's what I'm saying. That changed very differently. So in the early days, I couldn't go to a gathering of people, like a party or something, and not be talking about Ruby and Heart. I couldn't do that. And now I can. I can go to a party and not mention them. Unless someone asks me, I will, of course, but I don't have that same desperate need, because I think partly because I talk about Ruby and Heart all the time. I have a lot of outlets because I've built this community that is grief aware, that knows that it's okay to talk about Ruby and Heart. And in fact, I like when they talk about Ruby and Heart. So I don't feel like it's a part of my life that has to stay shuttered, in the past.
But the image that I had when you were talking about how central it is, and the metaphor that I often use is this, which someone spoke about somewhere, so it's not mine, but it's like this grief ball within a context of your life. And at the beginning, when it happens, that grief ball or that loss sort of takes up most of the space of life, and it doesn't have much room to move. And it hits the pain point all the time, sort of a button on the side of the container, imaginatively. And I think with time, life, the grief ball doesn't get smaller, the reality of the loss doesn't change, but life, you collect more experiences, more situations, life becomes larger, as in this picture. And so it doesn't remain at the center because there's more room around. And to the place where I am now, it's part of me, but it does definitely no longer center stage.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. I like that metaphor that we grow. I think about like growing around. I talk about in my mind the idea of growing around the holes in my heart. So I have these two holes in my heart, and they don't heal. I don't personally. I don't like the word heal in terms of grief. Just for me, it doesn't work. I'm not healing because the wounds aren't closing. They aren't going away for me. Mm-hmm. But I like the idea of growing around them.
Okay.
So that's what I sort of think about, the two holes in my heart, and then I'm just trying to expand my heart so there's so much more growth around them. So
that's interesting. When you say you don't see them as healing, what has happened with those holes within those 6 years? What would you, if you look at them, how did you deal with those holes in your heart?
I think I've tried very hard to really honor that those holes are there, and then I'm going to grow around them at the same time. I'm going to grow with them. So to my mind, I try to hold the idea that Ruby and Hart are here with me because I'm alive, and they shaped me, and they shaped so many other people, and I want to be in this life that I'm living right now. I don't want to live in denial. I don't want to live in a fantasy world where they're still alive, or that I'm just in the past with them. I want to be here present and bring them with me as best I can in spirit. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of how I conceive of it, my life now. So again, we're fostering to adopt. So we're parenting these two other teenagers, and everything I know about parenting I got from Ruby and Hart. And it's in a way it's like it keeps Ruby and Hart even more present because I'm always thinking about them as I parent these other two kids, and because they're still in the foster system, I'm not allowed to say their names. So I'm not being coy by calling them these kids, but they have names, but I'm not supposed to say them until we adopt them. Mm-hmm. So, but they're brother and sister, and just like Ruby and Hart were brother and sister, and so there's a lot of parallels and differences, and I'm trying to embrace all that.
So, if I think about those people who have had recent losses, what you're telling them sounds almost impossible, right? Like the kind of idea of I want to live in the now and I don't want to live in denial, which I think quite at the beginning in the raw part of grief, it's also understandable if we are in denial. Like I remember at the time, I felt like an actor in a film and this scene is going to stop. I felt like when you're saying the disbelief, I've had like, this is not real. This is like it's like a show, a Netflix show, and it's going to stop. Yeah. So what would we, like if we're scrolling back a little bit to the early time after, I mean, if you lose only two of your children, and there's two holes, but there's this big hole in your life. Yeah. How do you as a parent, thinking about all these other people who deal with their losses, how did you deal with that big hole or those two holes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that disbelief it's still with me. I was just talking to my wife last night saying, part of me feels like this is not real. It's been 6 years, but this is not real life, my real life is somewhere else. And this is a big, giant dream. But that feeling is not as present as it was in the early days. In the early days, that was pretty constant. I literally was in disbelief. I couldn't believe it. And there was a lot of despair and fear. I was very afraid in the early days that if I really wept, if I really, gave in to this grief and loss, I would never come back. I would lose my mind. I would go insane. And I think I sort of tried to hold on to some sense of like, I'm not going to just lose it because I'll never come back. And it took a while for me, a lot of sessions of weeping where I would weep and then I would come back, before I could feel safe, fully, keening, weeping. So there was a lot of that fear.
Which by the way, is a very common fear that people have. I hear this often.
Yeah. I read a lot of grief books too, so I did have that sense of like, okay, I get this. This is not just unique to me. But I also had this fear that, okay, I'm doing okay right now, but the other shoe is going to drop. Like someday I'm going to believe that they're gone forever, and then I'm going to lose it. If that makes sense. So it was hard to feel safe in grief for a while.
Yeah.
But your question was, what did I do with that? I forget what your question was now.
Yeah, you actually went there, sort of. You went into the early days, and that experience that you just in different ways explained. People can relate. You said, "Me too." That's and when you were saying it, you read a lot of grief books. Was it helpful for you to understand from those books what grief is and how grief is in terms of the normal expected reactions and responses that physically, emotionally you have? Was that helpful to you?
It was. Some of the grief books would upset me at times. Like I'd be reading, like, oh yes, and then I'd encounter some passage that I disagreed with, and I would throw it across the room. And what's so strange is I've talked to other bereaved people, and they use that same phrase. I threw it across the room, and I don't know. Maybe that's just something that a lot of grieving people do. They throw grief books across the room. I don't know. I think it'd be interesting to do a study. How many people have done that?
It might be a good approach for grief therapy.
Right. But I got so much out of so many of them. Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the things I got early on was the idea of again, reinforcing this idea of the importance of actually grieving, of actively grieving, of talking about it with your community. And that was very helpful. And I really loved It's Okay, You're Not Okay. That book helped me a lot in the early days. Yeah. I know some people in early grief, they have a hard time reading, but I didn't have a hard time reading. I wanted to read. I was very hungry. I was scared and hungry, and I wanted to read about other people, and how they survived. I actually had a friend, I asked her to send me articles about people who had worse losses. She said, really? I said, yes, I just want to read about other people who lost more than 2 kids. I just want to hear about that. I don't know. That somehow helped me. Yeah.
So when you were reading those stories of people decimated their whole family besides them, what did that do to you? Or in what way was that helpful to you?
I think it was helpful in me understanding that, bad things happen to good people. That I wasn't alone in that sense.
Yeah.
My wife and I felt very alone. Now I know lots of people who've lost children, but at the time I really didn't. And I certainly knew nobody who lost 2 kids.
Yeah.
That was outside the realm of my experience completely. I'd never even heard of it, really. I mean, obviously I've heard of it, but you know what I mean? Like not in my community in any sense.
Yeah.
And it was helpful to see, like, there are tragedies in life. And in a sense, we all endure tragedies. And that was just helpful. Even to this day, I sometimes want to watch, like World War I movies where just hundreds of thousands of young people are slaughtered. I don't know. It just is like, oh, right. This happens in life. It's dark, but it helps me.
Mm-hmm. Is it a sense of, so people surrounding those massive losses survive, that gives you a sense of, I can survive it too? Or gives you like a perspective of what can happen, or what happens on this earth?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's just that I think I had this feeling that life just got better and better. That was sort of, I really believed that. Like whatever struggles we had as a family or I had as a person, it always seemed to then get better, right? You know, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That sort of felt like, oh, that felt true. And so we'd have a struggle, and then we'd surmount it, and then be better for it. And this was a struggle that I didn't want to be better. I didn't want to gain something from this loss, and so that's another struggle that I've had, because I have actually gained from this loss. I have grown as a person. I do believe in post-traumatic growth, but I didn't want that in the early days. I rejected it. I rejected the idea that there was no silver lining. Nothing good could come from this.
Yeah.
And now I feel like I can talk about how I've grown as a person. I would, of course, trade it all immediately to have Ruben Hart back, but it feels disingenuous to deny that.
Yeah, I think there's a time and space for post-traumatic growth to be possible, to be embraced, to be seen as an option, and not because of the loss, but despite of the loss. But if it is introduced too early, and early doesn't have a time frame to it, if it's introduced too early, then it of course is rejected, because why would we want to gain something out of our loss? But that comes, if it comes by itself, or not by itself, but there is potential for everyone, I would say.
Yeah.
How would you say your loss and trauma has shaped you? Like, what have you gained? Or
I think I've gained real access to my emotions in a way that I didn't have before. I think I was emotionally closed off. That sounds extreme, because I was a very loving dad, and I was very, engaged, and I didn't see myself that way at all. But now, having wept for 6 years on and off, it feels different. I have a different level of empathy for other people. And I have an understanding of pain that I did not at all. And so as a result, I do feel like I can empathize with people in a way that I couldn't. And in early grief, for example, part of my grief spiel was I couldn't empathize. I didn't have any space to hear other people's grief. Like, some people would do that. They would, in an effort to like connect with me, they would share like, oh, I lost my cousin 10 years ago. I was like, you lost your cousin 10 years? My kids were killed like last week. I don't give a shit about your cousin. I'm like, no. And so I put that in my grief spiel. Like, don't tell me about your losses. I don't have the bandwidth for it. I think grief in the early days, and like I said, there's no timeline for early, but in the early days, however long that lasts, there is no room for other people's loss. It's very selfish in the early days. Grief, it just takes over everything. You just don't. That's what it is.
And it needs to be.
It needs to be. And I think I understood that. That's why my grief spiel, I think I was able to do the grief spiel, because I just understood that this takes precedence. I don't have space for anything else. But now I do. Now I have space for everyone else's grief and grieving, whatever they're grieving. A pet, a loss of a job. I have the bandwidth for that now.
How did it affect your relationship with Gail?
I think it brought us closer. I think for sure. But it was hard. I I think we both grieved in similar ways. So that was very helpful. But the main thing is that we talked about it. We talked about our grief with each other a lot. We both needed to. She had that same need. She wanted to talk about Ruby Heart. She wanted to talk about her feelings. And I think we had real honesty about our feelings. We still have real honesty about our grief. And so, even the uglier thoughts, I call them ugly thoughts, but like when you grief compare, when you hear in the early days that somebody is talking about their loss and you just get mad at them, right? Because your loss feels so much bigger than theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And so, those are the ugly grief thoughts that I have. But also, we would just be enraged at people who were just even nice to us, who were just like, look at us with too much pity in their eyes. Like, oh, how are you? And we'd go home and complain about them. We actually called it our hate du jour. And so we tell each other funny stories about how awful this person was, even if they were actually just being kind. And so I think we are closer than we were. We were close before, but we were even closer now because we're the only ones in the world who lost Ruby and Heart as children.
Yeah.
Other people lost them as friends and nieces and nephews, but grandchildren. But we're the only ones who were their parents.
In speaking with or at the conference with the Compassionate Friends, having had that experience myself, I know there's a lot of there's a lot of benefit and mutual loss of being grieving parents in that sense. And what I remember in my case, when I lost one of my twins, was like I felt like I was the only one that this would happen to. And you sort of alluded to the fact that I'm probably the only one who's lost two children at the same time with a drunk driver. Maybe tell a little bit about Compassionate Friends and how that has, in your case, supported your tending your heart's holes.
Yeah. It was hard to go to Compassionate Friends at first. But we were so desperate. We felt so alone that as soon as we found out about this organization, we were like, oh, I want to go. When's the next meeting? And some people were like, maybe you should wait a little bit. We didn't. And we actually went too early to our first meeting. It wasn't a good story. We went 3 weeks after our kids were killed. And it was jarring. The meeting went a little south because I remember one person just monopolized. You're supposed to go around the circle and tell, the name of the person you lost, when they died, and how they died. And we went all around this big circle. There's a lot of people in the room, which was also shocking. And this one woman just went on I was looking at the clock, like a full 20 minutes, talking about her story. And I was thinking, this is my first meeting, but I was thinking someone should stop this. And then she finished telling her story, and then she just left. She didn't even bother listening to anybody else's stories. So I don't know. She had a real need to vent, I guess. But and then we were still damaged from the car crash. We literally had broken ribs and cracked ribs. And somebody gave my wife this huge hug. And I was like, no. So it went bad. But that was the only one that went bad. Every other one was very helpful. And I think the helpful parts were being in community. People just, they get it, Other bereaved people who are actively grieving get it in a way that other people don't. Mm-hmm. And it was very helpful. It was very helpful to sit with them and talk about Ruby and Heart and our grief and hear other people sharing their loss. There's something that and so that community I still get a lot from, because not just Compassionate Friends, but other bereaved parents that I spend time with. It's helpful to me. It helps me feel not so alone.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the timing to go, because I think when we're looking at Shiva is where the center of the conversation and the time is Ruby and Heart in your case. It is you as the parents who've lost children, and it is the topic is your children. Whereas when you go to a meeting of compassionate friends, it's a lot of people who had losses. So it's about all of you. And so to make that transition there's a need in grief to say, this is me and my loss, this is me and my loss, to then share me and my loss with anyone else's loss. To make that transition, to allow space for others, that requires space, to have actually that space where it can happen.
Yeah.
One of the things which you said before made me realize, I realized before, but I think it's important to mention, through the accident that you had. I mean, first of all, you were involved in the accident, your children were killed in the accident, but there was trauma intermingled with the loss. And it is a traumatic loss as per definition, but just in terms of what your experience, we would have to ask, but in terms of the way they were taken from life in a sudden killing. And then you mentioned you had bruises as well. So you had to deal with your healing, physical healing, in this sense. And as well, you and your wife were the survivors and your children died in that instant. How do you see, in terms of your situation, the trauma and the grief intermingled?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. First of all, I don't call it an accident. I call it a car crash.
Yeah.
Just because, a drunk driver, she didn't get drunk accidentally. She didn't get behind the wheel accidentally. She made these choices that resulted in my children being killed. And she was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. So I like saying it's a crash, not an accident.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up. Yeah.
Thank you. And it was very traumatic. We were both knocked unconscious in the crash. So I had no idea what happened. So I came to, and there was whiteness in front of me. I had no idea what was happening. It was an airbag, but I didn't know that. It took me a while to understand where I was and what had happened. I remember I got out of my car, and I just really had no idea because the crash was gone. I have no memory of the impact. And there was no tire, there was no brake squeals because she just hit us. She didn't brake because she was drunk and high. So it was out of the blue, and I literally had no idea. I was looking around. There was a car in the distance that was on fire. That was hers. But I thought, what happened? Was there were we both hit by somebody else, or was it what happened? And I walked around the car, and then I saw Ruby's door, the point of impact. It was caved in 2 feet. And that's when I started to understand what had happened to us. But that being knocked unconscious part, I think, added to the unreality of it and the confusion. It just seemed like a nightmare. Like I was literally having a nightmare. Something, it was so incomprehensible what had happened to us. And so that, I think that trauma fed into the disbelief part. I had no time to understand what had happened to us from a conscious place. It came from unconscious, from knocked unconscious. But for me, the strange thing about it was that Gail and I were able to walk away from the crash. So she had broken ribs and a cracked sternum. I had cracked ribs. I had a lacerated kidney and a lot of pain in my knee, and she had glass in her lip, and but we were okay. And she was very bruised from the seatbelt. But it was upsetting in a way how okay we were. I wanted the physical pain to, like we were in the same car. I wanted to be more damaged. And when we started to heal, we healed kind of quickly. I think within a few weeks, all those bruises were gone. And all the pain, the physical pain was gone. And I missed it in a way. I was like, well, I don't want to be better.
Yeah, because the emotional bruises are not visible.
Right, and it didn't match. It didn't match anymore at all. It never really matched, but it was. So that was strange. And the trauma part, I think we didn't have signs of PTSD. We didn't have like classical signs of PTSD. I flash on the night of the crash a lot, but it doesn't feel like sort of, technically pathological, whatever it is that you would assign as post-traumatic stress. So yeah, I don't know if I have more intelligent things to say about trauma than that.
The part is that what you're sharing is that the physical hurts, they go onto the path of healing without. I mean, of course, certain things need to be mended or broken bones to be set if they are out of place. But there's many things that are physical pains that are healing on their own. So certain things do, but certain things don't. But let's assume the physical, if it is set right, then it heals with time. Whereas the emotional wounds and the trauma, that requires, in most cases, some attention. And the interesting thing is, as you were saying, the bruises, they disappear with time. But the emotional, the holes in your heart, as you described them metaphorically, they don't just go away. No one can see them, but they're still very intensely felt.
Yeah. And that's a disconnect there. That was hard to reconcile.
Yeah. So what would you wish you would have known at the beginning of that traumatic crash in terms of grieving that you know now?
Yeah. I think it took me a while to not be afraid of the pain. It took me a little while to figure out that it was okay, and that in fact it helped me. I talk about it in my book, the idea of I call it like leaning into the pain, not in a masochistic way or a sadistic way, but the idea of not being afraid of it. It took me a little while to really understand that, and that seems really important to me. That's been my way of processing the grief, ultimately to get to a place of joy. So it was very hard for me to look at Ruby and Hart's pictures, and it still is. It still gets me, but I'm able to access so many of beautiful memories of them, and happy memories of them, and I believe that I wouldn't be able to get those happy memories if I didn't just first allow myself to feel that pain. So any sense of wanting to block that out, because the first time you think about them, it hurts so much. And I figured out pretty quickly that sort of exposure therapy wise, that if I expose myself to the pain of thinking about them and looking at them, remembering them, that the joy would keep building, and the pain would reduce, and that's been true. I'm really glad that that's true. That because I've thought about them a lot and looked at the pictures a lot, I feel a lot of joy. I have a lot of access to positive memories of them. And the very early days, I couldn't remember good stuff. I just felt pain. And then the community, I still feel, even though in my book I talk a lot about community, and I talked to you already about the early revelation of how important it is. I still feel a little anxious or awkward calling people together to memorialize Ruby and Hart. So we do it a lot. We have ritual gatherings often. And in fact, we had one, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we had one yesterday. We gathered in a park. We bought cupcakes. So it was Ruby's birthday is March 29th and Heart's is March 30th. So they were 3 years and 1 day apart.
Yeah.
And that was always so special and beautiful, right? When they were little kids, they would celebrate together. And then when they got older, they'd get separate weekends. But it was always, birthday time for them. The end of March. It was so beautiful. And now it's hard. Right now, the end of March is very difficult for Gail and I because it's Ruby and Heart's birthdays. And what do you do? And so this year we gathered in a park. We had cupcakes, and we actually there's a cross at the crash site that a local teenager built for them. And after the crash, didn't know them, just put this cross up. And she wrote beautiful angels on it. She didn't know their names. She wrote beautiful angels and painted it blue. And out in the desert, 5 years later, it's pretty battered and it actually cracked. And so we did a new one. I built the new cross, and we had everybody paint one of the letters. It said beautiful angels, and then it had Ruby and Heart's names and their dates of birth and the dates of their deaths. And everybody got a black paintbrush and painted one of the letters. And that was really nice. And even so, it still feels a little awkward, like, hey, will you all come gather? But then at every time, people come up to me and they're so grateful. They're like, thank you for having this. This was so meaningful to me. I'm so glad I could be here. And I would like to remind myself and your listeners that asking people to come to honor your loved one who's passed away, it's not a burden on them. It feels like it, but it's not. They want to do it, and it's so nice. It's so nice to be in community on these hard days.
Mm. Thank you for sharing how you honor their birthdays. And given the years, I must assume one of them would have had their 20th birthday.
Yeah, 20 and 23.
Yeah. It's also quite a milestone, I know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your openness in sharing about Ruby and Heart.
Oh, thank you.
I almost feel like I want to know more about their stories and their funny skits that they did. Thank you so much for opening up today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.